It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Donald Robertson, and we're going to be discussing his book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. Don, welcome to the show.
Hi, Shaun. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's kick our conversation off with a bit of what we might call the Donald Robertson origin story. Think of this as for those encountering you for the very first time in our conversation, what are a few of the things they should know about you? So let's start that off with a little bit about growing up in Scotland. Your accent kind of gives you away. So what are a few things we should know about your time growing up in Scotland?
Well, I was born in Ayr on the west coast of Scotland, and I went to university there. I studied philosophy. And I guess when I was in my early 20s, I left Scotland and I moved to England. I probably spent most of my adult life living there, although now, confusingly, I'm a Canadian and I live in Canada.
One of the things you share in the latter part of the book, you talk about around age 13 is when you first started to encounter philosophy, and it sets you down this path where you eventually encounter Stoicism. So we'd love to hear a little bit about what it was like for you to begin pursuing a study of philosophy at such a young age.
Well, yeah, I haven't really thought about this all that much. Well, not for a few years until I came to writing the book, and then I started to think how I first became interested in philosophy. And I suppose it's a little bit of an unusual beginning. My father was a Freemason, but that wasn't unusual in the time where I lived. Our national bard, Robert Burns, the Scottish national bard, was famously a master Freemason, and many of my friends' fathers were Freemasons as well. And my father died when I was quite young, when I was about 13, 14 years old. And he didn't leave many things behind, but one of the things that he left was a bunch of books, maybe about 3 or 4 books on Freemasonry. And for some reason, I decided that I was going to start reading them. And I guess I'd kind of absorbed some very vague or basic principles about Freemasonry as a guide to life and ethics from my father. And then I started to read about the symbolism, and boy, I couldn't understand any of it. It seemed very cryptic to me. So I started to try and learn more. I started to try and learn the Hebrew language. I started to read the Bible, and then I started to read the apocryphal Christian literature, Gnostic Christian literature. And strangely, that led me into studying ancient Greek philosophy, because some of the Gnostic scriptures were very heavily influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy. And so that got me reading about Neoplatonism and about Plato. It's a bit of trivia a lot of people might not realize. The Nag Hammadi library, it's one of our main libraries of Gnostic Christian literature. It had several books in it that contained early Gnostic Christian Gospels, and bound alongside them was an excerpt from Plato's Republic. So one of the Gnostic Bibles, as it were, had Plato in it, surprisingly. So how different the world would be, perhaps, if we had a Bible that actually had Plato in it. It's like a parallel universe or something like that. But that got me reading Plato as a kid, and it really affected me. And
at what point in your journey do you encounter Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism? When did that come into your path?
Well, I'll give you a kind of a lightning tour of how that happened. It's very simple. I went to university and I thought I'll do a degree in philosophy. And degrees in philosophy in Scotland are 4 years long, and at the end of it I still felt that I hadn't got my questions answered. This was my best attempt to try and understand life, the universe, and everything. And I got to the end of my philosophy degree and I thought that was really cool, but I really do feel a lot more confused now than I was at the beginning. I didn't find this kind of thing that I was looking for that was going to answer all of my questions and give me a philosophy of life. And I went back to reading the Gnostics, and I went back to reading Plotinus, and I found a good book by a French scholar called Pierre Hadot, called Plotinus, The Simplicity of Vision, and it blew me away. And I started to read Hadot's other books, which were about Hellenistic philosophy in general, and about the spiritual exercises that he found in ancient literature. And I quickly realized that he thought the Stoics were the main storehouse of these spiritual exercises. And so that really caught my interest. And Hadot introduced me to the Stoics and Marcus Aurelius, basically. And the irony is that in a traditional philosophy degree, you don't normally study the Stoics. It's probably the main school of ancient philosophy that's ignored in most undergraduate philosophy degrees. And the reason is that academics will say that the Stoics didn't invent any new philosophical ideas. They merely developed the practical or psychological implications or application of ideas that are found in Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. So they're like, well, we don't need to read that. They're just telling us how to put this stuff into practice. And that, ironically, is precisely the reason that people in the general public find the Stoics so appealing, because they focus on the practical application. And at the same time, I was beginning my training as a psychotherapist and as a counsellor, and I was learning about cognitive behavioural therapy. And suddenly all these things, like in a flash of lightning, all came together for me and suddenly made sense. And that was 20 odd years ago, or, maybe nearly 30 years ago now. And, I haven't looked back since, as they say.
I'm intrigued by the wide range of things in your bio, as far as it described you as a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist, writer, and trainer specializing in the relationship between philosophy, psychology, and self-improvement. Like, how did that mashup, so to speak, all kind of come together? Because I've met people who might do one or two of those things, but you've brought together a wide range of different disciplines. How did that come about?
Well, I'll give the short answer is that after I did my degree, I went on to do a master's degree at Sheffield University, which was in an interdisciplinary department. And so my master's degree is in the interdisciplinary study of philosophy and psychotherapy. And I started to become particularly interested in the relationship between ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Stoicism, and modern evidence-based psychotherapy, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy. And the other odd thing I'd say about that is that although these seem like different subjects today, that's only, as it were, kind of a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, if you like, that in the ancient world, nobody really thought that these were separate things. In psychotherapy isn't a modern concept. The ancient Greeks had a concept of psychological therapy for the psyche. They talked about it a lot, but they never for a minute thought that it was a separate subject from philosophy. The Stoics thought that psychotherapy and philosophy were two sides of the same way. They describe these things as if it's kind of an amalgam of several different subjects, but really we're just reuniting things that thousands of years ago were all part of one big package.
In terms of what we're facing in challenges in culture broadly today, why do we need the writings of Marcus Aurelius so much? As I was listening to your book and having encountered other books recently, we talked briefly about Ryan Holiday before we jumped into the interview. Why do those writings feel so applicable today to our culture?
There are lots of different answers I could give to that question. And I suppose one of them is the Stoics. The Stoics provide a therapy. They used to call it the promise of philosophy, a balm for troubled minds, as it were. So this is this promise of developing our psychological health and helping us to overcome emotional distress. It's kind of medicine for the soul, and that attracts people. But unlike many other self-help and therapy approaches, because Stoicism was also a philosophy, it tried to attack the problem of emotional suffering at a very deep philosophical level. And that means it also does it at a very universal level. So, for example, we'll maybe talk more about this later, but one of the fundamental principles of Stoicism is to clarify the distinction between things that are under our control and things that aren't under our control. And that would apply in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, in medieval Europe, and in modern day America or Canada. Like, it's so fundamental that it's perennial, it's timeless, and it applies across the ages in any culture. And so one of the reasons I think Stoicism is relevant today is that it's so generic. that it still kind of has this value because it's so deep and so philosophical a therapeutic approach. But I suppose another thing that you could say is that many people today tell me that they feel overwhelmed by global news, issues like global warming, politics in other countries and on the global stage and so on. And we're bombarded with information through social media. And a lot of it is deliberately designed to try and provoke our emotions. So the news cycle, it's kind of like it's engineered to upset us and provoke us and grab our attention as much as possible. And we're getting this beamed in our faces all day through the internet. And so we're bombarded with things that's highly emotionally charged, but often about situations that are beyond our direct control. And so many people that are drawn to Stoicism tell me that they feel that they need a way of coping with this challenge that's become intensified over the last couple of decades. And Stoicism particularly tried to offer a way for people to remain in control of their emotions, while not giving up and becoming nihilistic, remaining committed to their values, but in a way that wasn't emotionally frustrating to them. And that, I think, is something that's much needed in the face of social media and modern society.
In terms of, say, your practice, if you were working with a client who was, say, dealing with debilitating fear and anxiety, how might you coach them or encourage them in the direction of how Stoic philosophy might be a partial answer to what they're facing? How would you apply that to a situation like that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, just as an aside, a kind of caveat, which is that if somebody comes to a psychotherapist and they have a diagnosable mental health problem like an anxiety disorder, then their ethical obligation would be to deliver the most evidence-based treatment protocol. And that wouldn't be classical Stoicism, like it'd be modern evidence-based CBT. But clients are often looking for something that they can add into that, like to give them a broader perspective, more of a philosophy of life. And that's where Stoicism might come in. It also has some ideas and some techniques that can complement CBT, because CBT was originally inspired by Stoic philosophy. So if somebody comes to therapy, we wouldn't sit down and do Stoicism with them, but there might be elements of Stoicism that would come into the discussion and would benefit the client. And so let's say somebody is suffering from anxiety. Let's start off with the basics. So the fundamental principle of Stoicism is that we should clearly distinguish between what's up to us and what isn't. And the Stoics think that the root cause of a lot of emotional distress is that we act and think and feel as if things that aren't under our direct control somehow are. And we blur this boundary. And so first of all, they think that just becoming clearer about this distinction will help to reduce the intensity of a lot of the emotional distress that we're experiencing. And doing that will help us to think more clearly and problem solve about some of the situations that we're facing. And I could do a deep dive into that if you want and give you some very specific examples of how that might affect somebody who's experiencing anxiety. But before that, I'll just go on to one of the other principles that is very familiar from Stoicism, and that actually forms the basis of cognitive therapy. And that's the idea that it's not things that upset us, but our judgments or opinions about things, particularly our value judgments. So we call that realization cognitive distancing today. And over the past 10 or 20 years, there's a large body of research that shows that it may be one of the most important strategies in the whole field of psychotherapy, just realizing that when we're upset with things, it's specific thoughts and beliefs that we have that are coloring our emotions, shaping our emotions. And so when we know that when people are upset, they usually kind of forget that and they fuse their value judgments or beliefs with external reality as if there's no difference or distance between them. And just getting people to realize that they're projecting beliefs or values onto external events has a very powerful effect. It increases cognitive or psychological flexibility and helps people achieve more control over their emotions and allows them to experience less emotional suffering. So it's a kind of subtle concept, but we know that it's fundamentally important, and the Stoics were onto that nearly 2,500 years ago.
Well, I'd love to have you do a bit of a deep dive if you're willing. So if you'd like to take us a little bit further, I think that'd be helpful.
Sure. If somebody has severe anxiety, let's go back to this basic concept of distinguishing between what's up to us and what isn't. So, there are two sides of that. People often try to struggle against and take too much control over things that don't have direct control over, and on the other hand, they're often neglectful of or avoid or neglect to take responsibility, ownership for things that potentially are under their voluntary control. So say somebody's suffering from severe pervasive anxiety, like generalized anxiety disorder is one of the diagnoses that we would use today for that. It's called the worrying disorder, where you might say someone who suffers from pathological worrying might be diagnosed as having generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. And one way of describing what's going on with those clients is that they become very frustrated with and focused on and try to control sensations of anxiety, like or muscular tension, or their heart beating faster than normal, that aren't under their direct control. So they'll try and kind of avoid thinking about these things. They'll try and force themselves to relax. They'll try and suppress them or block them from their mind. And really, they're kind of struggling against things that are happening to them that we now know actually in the long term it's healthier often to accept those feelings and to learn to just kind of ride them out patiently, because they'll often wax and wane naturally. So if somebody's heart's beating fast, rather than forcing themselves to avoid thinking about it or trying to kind of force themselves to relax, it might be better just to accept the feeling, view it as natural, as non-threatening, and just to kind of wait it out, and then it'll often go away of its own accord. But if you become upset about it, you'll usually just make it worse. If you try and not think about it, paradoxically, you'll often just make yourself focus on it even more. So people really tie themselves in knots trying to struggle against these kind of involuntary physiological sensations that accompany anxiety. And that can really be quite toxic, especially over the long term. Now, the irony is that when people are suffering from what we would call worrying, a particular type of anxiety where people think a lot about things and they try to problem solve, but they're not doing it effectively, and they have what we call what if or catastrophic thinking. What if I lose my job? What if I get sick? And their mind goes over and over and over all of these kind of catastrophic scenarios that might happen to them in the future. So people will often say that they feel that their worrying is uncontrollable, but actually what the research tells us is that people have more control than they realize over the process of thinking. So to take a really simple example, people actually have quite a lot of control over how much time they spend dwelling on those thoughts. So they can learn to set them aside and pick them up again at a later point. We call that worry postponement. So this is a high-level voluntary cognitive process, although people usually allow it just to run amok and they don't, take a hold of the reins, as it were, and actually exert the control that they have over worried thinking. So there's a failure here to distinguish between things that are up to us and things that are not. People are banging their head against the wall, struggling with and getting upset about aspects of anxiety that aren't under their control. But at the same time, they're neglecting to do anything about the aspects that are potentially under their voluntary control.
Sadly, we're running out of time, so we're going to have to enter into the home stretch. But Don, thanks for that helpful example. I feel like that's a good way to illustrate one application of Stoic philosophy in terms of dealing with fear and anxiety. When you think of, say, a reader getting to the last page of this book, what's the big idea? What do you hope each and every reader takes away from their time with this volume?
Well, one of the main things is just I want to introduce people to the classics in Stoic literature. And so I always say very simply, if somebody said to me they were inspired to go away and read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, I'd feel very happy about them. It would be as if someone told me they were really into Elizabethan English literature, but they'd never heard of Shakespeare. And I had the good fortune to be able to say to them, hey, you should check out Hamlet. It's supposed to be really good. It's like I'm introducing them to masterpieces of classical philosophical literature. So if someone tells me they go away and read that stuff, then I feel that my job is done. But also just the realization that maybe that there are strategies that they use to help themselves. There are a whole bunch of them in the Stoic literature, and that their beliefs, their values, and their thinking might be shaping their emotions. They're not a victim of their emotions. They're not passively experiencing these things, but they can change the way they feel about situations that are troubling them in life by examining their underlying beliefs and values. That, to me, is the fundamental insight of Stoicism, and also happens to be the fundamental insight of cognitive therapy.
Well, in terms of resources or volumes, that would be a great follow-up. Would you recommend one of your other books as a good follow-up, or any specific editions or volumes that you think would be a worthwhile read?
In terms of books, I mean, I have another book called Stoicism and the Art of Happiness, which is like a very simple self-help guide to introduce people to Stoicism. And there are loads of books now coming out all of the time. You know, Ryan Holiday's books are really good, particularly The Daily Stoic, I would recommend. That's probably the best-selling book on Stoicism by quite a large margin. And Massimo Paolucci's books on Stoicism, How to be a Stoic, for example, is a very good book. And also, I'm part of a non-profit organization run by a multidisciplinary team of volunteers called Modern Stoicism. And if people want to go and have a look at the Modern Stoicism website, they'll find free courses and hundreds of articles and loads of different free online resources to help them learn about Stoicism, in particular about its practical applications in the modern world.
And Don, for the listeners who'd like to connect with you and find out more, where can they find you on the web?
Well, my website is just donaldrobertson.name. So it's just my name, Donald Robertson, all one word. And then instead of .com, it's .name.
And like we do with every episode, we'll include detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Don and pick up your own copy of his book and some of the other books that we've mentioned today. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Donald Robertson. Once again, our book today was How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. Again, for more on Donald and his books, a great place to start is his website. You can find that over at donaldrobertson.name. And Don, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Thanks, Shaun.